Every spring, 15,000 visitors pay £30 each to walk through the gardens of Highgrove House. They admire the wildflower meadows, the thyme walk, the stumpery built from 300 ancient oak roots. Guidebooks call it a living masterpiece. But there is a room on the first floor where Diana Spencer once sat alone for entire weekends, listening to the phone ring in her husband's study, knowing exactly who was on the other end of the line. Camilla Parker Bowles lived 11 miles away, and this house, the one Charles bought to build a family, became the place where Diana understood that her marriage was a performance with no audience. Chapter 1: The Prince Who Needed a Stage. Before he found a wife, Charles found a house, and the order tells you everything. In the summer of 1980, the Prince of Wales was 31 years old. He was the most eligible bachelor in the Western world. He had been linked to dozens of women, from Davina Sheffield to Lady Sarah Spencer. The tabloids followed every date, every weekend invitation, every rumor. But while the press watched his romantic life, Charles was quietly doing something far more revealing. He was shopping for a country estate. The property he settled on was Highgrove House, a 9-bedroom Georgian manor sitting on 347 acres in the parish of Dowton, near Tetbury, Gloucestershire. The house was built between 1796 and 1798. It was handsome, but not grand. Its pale stone walls and symmetrical facade were pleasant, respectable, unremarkable. By royal standards, it was almost modest. The asking price was £865,000, and the seller was Maurice Macmillan, the son of former Prime Minister Harold Macmillan. The Duchy of Cornwall handled the purchase. And just like that, Prince Charles had a home. But the question nobody asked loudly enough at the time was this: why this house? Why Gloucestershire? The answer lay partly in what Charles wanted and partly in what he already had. He wanted a working estate, a place where he could farm, experiment with organic agriculture, and build the kind of rooted, landed life that his upbringing at Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle had never provided. He had spent much of his 20s feeling displaced. The palaces were his mother's domain. Balmoral was a family ritual. Sandringham was tradition. Charles wanted something that was his, a blank canvas where he could express ideas about architecture, ecology, and tradition that his family regarded with polite bewilderment. Highgrove offered that. The house needed work. The gardens were neglected. The farmland was conventional. For a man who already saw himself as a custodian rather than a consumer, this was perfect. He could shape the land according to his vision. He could plant hedgerows and wildflower meadows. He could strip away the chemical farming practices of the previous decades and return the soil to something older and more honest. There was also the matter of the neighborhood. Gloucestershire was home to a particular kind of English country life that Charles adored. The Beaufort Hunt met nearby. Old families with old money lived in stone houses behind long driveways. It was a world of church fetes and shooting weekends and dinner parties where everyone knew everyone. And among those everyone, living at Middlewick House in the village of Corsham, just 11 miles down narrow Cotswold lanes, were Andrew and Camilla Parker Bowles. Charles and Camilla had met in 1971. Their relationship had been intense but complicated by his naval career and her eventual marriage to Andrew Parker Bowles in 1973. By 1980, Camilla was settled into county life with 2 children. She and Charles remained close. How close is a matter of perspective and timing. But the geography is not a matter of perspective. It is a matter of fact. 11 miles, 14 minutes by car. Charles moved into Highgrove and began planning his gardens. He consulted experts. He read about permaculture. He walked the fields and imagined what they could become. The interiors were secondary to him. The house was fine. It was the land that excited him. The estate had its own history, of course. The original house was commissioned by John Paul Paul, a local landowner, and designed in the restrained neoclassical style that defined late Georgian architecture. Over nearly 2 centuries, it had passed through several families, each leaving their mark without fundamentally altering its character. The Macmillan family had owned it since the 1960s. By the time Charles viewed the property, the house was well maintained, but unremarkable. No famous architect had reshaped it. No legendary garden designer had touched the grounds. It was, in estate agent language, a property with potential. Charles saw that potential immediately. He saw not what the house was, but what it could become. He imagined the parkland restored to native grassland. He imagined the walled kitchen garden producing organic vegetables. He imagined orchards and hedgerows and the kind of traditional mixed farming that had been abandoned across England in favor of industrial monoculture. He imagined, in short, a private paradise built on principles that most people in 1980 considered eccentric at best. The purchase went through without public fanfare. The press noted it briefly. A country house for the Prince of Wales. How nice, how sensible. Nobody saw it as the most important decision Charles would make that decade, more important even than his choice of wife. But that is what it was. The house came first. The bride came second. And the gap between those two decisions, small as it was in time, was vast in meaning. He did not yet have a wife. He did not yet have children. But he had his house, and in that sequence of priorities, everything that followed was already written. Chapter 2. A bride arrives at someone else's dream. Diana was 20 years old when she first saw Highgrove, and she smiled because she did not yet understand what it meant. The wedding took place on the 29th of July, 1981, at St. Paul's Cathedral. 750 million people watched the broadcast. Diana wore a dress with a 25-foot train. The Archbishop of Canterbury called it the stuff of fairy tales. The couple kissed on the balcony at Buckingham Palace, and the crowd roared. Then the fairy tale moved to Gloucestershire. Diana arrived at Highgrove as the most famous woman on the planet, and she walked into a house that already belonged to someone else, not legally. Legally, it was the Duchy of Cornwall's property, and she was now the Princess of Wales. But emotionally, spiritually, in every way that mattered when you close the front door and try to feel at home, Highgrove was Charles's. He had chosen it. He had begun reshaping it. The bones of the house reflected his taste, his history, his vision of what a life should look like. Diana tried. She genuinely tried. She hired the South African interior designer, Dudley Poplack, to redecorate the house. Poplack brought in pastel fabrics, comfortable furniture, warmth. He softened the rooms. Diana wanted chintz and color, family photographs on every surface, flowers in every vase. She wanted the house to feel like a home where children would run through corridors and dogs would sleep on sofas and the kitchen would smell like something baking. She wanted, in other words, what most 20-year-olds want when they move into their first real home. She wanted it to feel like hers. But a house that already has a personality resists a new one. And Charles had opinions, strong opinions, about architecture, about decoration, about what constituted taste. He favored a more traditional aesthetic, guided by his admiration for historical craftsmanship. Poplack's work was fine, but it sat uneasily alongside Charles's broader vision for the estate. The interior was Diana's project. The exterior, the gardens, the farm, the landscape, all of that was Charles's. And in a marriage where the two people were already struggling to find common ground, this division of territory was not collaboration. It was early evidence of separation. There were good days. There were weekends when Diana walked the grounds and Charles pointed out what he was planting. There were evenings in the drawing room. There were dinner parties with neighbors. The Gloucestershire set welcomed Diana, or appeared to. She was charming, funny, disarmingly honest. People liked her immediately. But Diana was a Londoner at heart. She had grown up at Park House on the Sandringham estate, but her teenage years and young adulthood had been spent in the city. She loved Kensington. She loved shops, restaurants, friends who lived 5 minutes away. Highgrove was beautiful, but it was also remote. The nearest town of any size was Tetbury, population around 5,000. The nearest city was Bristol, an hour's drive. For a young woman whose social life had revolved around London flatmates and dance classes, Gloucestershire was exile dressed up as paradise. The isolation was physical before it became emotional. At Kensington, Diana could walk out the door and be in a world of noise and movement within minutes. At Highgrove, she could walk out the door and find fields, sheep, silence, the sound of wind through mature trees, and, in the distance, the occasional bark of a dog from a neighboring estate. Some people find this peaceful. Diana found it suffocating. The house was surrounded by beauty, but beauty without company is just scenery. And Diana was, above everything else, a person who needed company. She needed conversation, laughter, the energy of other people. Highgrove gave her none of these things unless she organized them herself, and organizing social life in rural Gloucestershire when you are 20 years old and know almost nobody is a particular kind of challenge. And there was something else, something she would not fully articulate until years later, in interviews and private conversations that eventually became public. The neighbors, the dinner party circuit, the way everyone seemed to know Camilla, the way Camilla seemed to know everything about Charles, the casual intimacy of it, the phone calls, the ease. Diana noticed. She noticed the way Charles brightened when certain names came up. She noticed the way weekends at Highgrove coincided with social events where Camilla would be present. She noticed and she stored it away, because in 1981 she still believed the house could become the home she imagined. She still believed the nursery would fix everything. The dream was still intact. Fragile, yes, already showing hairline cracks that would widen into fractures over the coming years, but still intact. Two people in a Georgian house in the English countryside, married for less than a year, with everything ahead of them. Charles saw the gardens he would build. Diana saw the children she would raise. They were looking at the same future through different windows, and neither of them realized that the views would never converge. Chapter 3: The Nursery and the Walled Garden. For a brief window, Highgrove looked exactly like the life Diana had been promised. Prince William Arthur Philip Lewis was born on the 21st of June, 1982, at St. Mary's Hospital in Paddington. He was the first heir to the throne, born in a hospital rather than a palace. Diana held him on the steps for the cameras, and the country fell deeper in love with her. When she brought him home to Highgrove, she filled the nursery with everything a baby could need: soft toys, painted furniture, blankets in pale blues and whites. The room faced south, catching the afternoon light. For a few months, the house felt exactly as Diana had hoped: warm, full, alive. Prince Henry Charles Albert David, known from the start as Harry, arrived on the 15th of September, 1984. Now there were two small boys in the nursery, and Diana's world at Highgrove contracted to the dimensions of motherhood. She bathed them. She played with them on the lawn. She took them to local shops in Tetbury, pushing a pram like any young mother, trailed at a discreet distance by protection officers. Staff at Highgrove later recalled that Diana was happiest during these years, not happy in the way the public imagined, not fairy tale happy, but genuinely engaged. She had purpose. The children gave Highgrove a reason to exist. But while Diana was filling the nursery, Charles was filling the garden. The transformation of Highgrove's grounds began in earnest in the early 1980s and would continue for decades. When Charles arrived, the gardens were uninspired. A few mature trees, some tired borders. Nothing that reflected the estate's potential or its new owner's ambition. Charles saw the blank canvas he had always wanted. He sought out Miriam Rothschild, the eccentric and brilliant naturalist, who advised him on wildflower meadows. Under her guidance, Charles planted swathes of native wildflowers across the estate. Cowslips, oxeye daisies, field scabious, knapweed. The meadows were designed to look effortless, but they required precise management. Mowing schedules, seed collection, soil analysis. It was farming disguised as beauty. He consulted Rosemary Very, the legendary garden designer from nearby Barnsley House. Very helped shape the formal areas closer to the house. The thyme walk, planted with dozens of varieties along a flagstone path, became one of Highgrove's most celebrated features. She brought structure and tradition to Charles's wilder instincts. The walled garden took shape. The sundial garden emerged. An Islamic garden inspired by Charles's admiration for geometric patterns in Islamic art was planned and planted. Every corner of the 9 acres closest to the house was considered, debated, redesigned, and planted again. Charles was not a casual gardener. He was obsessive. He spent hours walking the grounds, notebook in hand. He discussed soil pH and companion planting with the intensity other men reserved for stock portfolios. The gardens became his language, his therapy, his most honest form of self-expression. They were where he felt most himself. The numbers tell a story of their own. Over the following years, the garden budget at Highgrove would grow into something extraordinary. Thousands of rare plants sourced from specialist nurseries across Britain and Europe. Hundreds of trees planted. Miles of new hedgerow established. A kitchen garden producing vegetables for the house and eventually for a commercial product line. The total investment in the grounds, by some estimates, ran into millions of pounds, all funded through the Duchy of Cornwall. Diana watched this unfold with a mixture of boredom and resentment. She did not share Charles's passion for soil and seed. She found his obsessive interest in organic farming alienating. Later, in conversations with friends that were documented in Andrew Morton's biography, she would describe the loneliness of watching her husband walk out the door every morning to spend the day in his garden while she sat inside with 2 toddlers and a mounting sense of dread. 2 worlds were being built at Highgrove. One was made of laughter and nappies and bedtime stories. The other was made of root systems and wildflower seed mixes and conversations with experts about things Diana could not bring herself to care about. Both worlds existed on the same property. Both were real, but they were growing in opposite directions, and the distance between the nursery and the walled garden was becoming the distance between 2 people who could no longer pretend they wanted the same life. Chapter 4. 11 miles between two houses. The distance from Highgrove to Middlewick House could be driven in 14 minutes, and Charles knew the route by memory. To understand what happened inside the walls of Highgrove, you must first understand the geography outside them. Gloucestershire is a county of small roads. Lanes twist between stone walls and hedgerows. Villages appear and vanish in a few hundred meters. The landscape is gentle, rolling, ancient. It is the kind of place where neighbors know each other because there is no one else to know. Social life revolves around a tight circuit of dinner parties, hunt meets, church services, and charity events. Everyone is connected. Privacy exists only by mutual agreement. Middlewick House sat near the village of Corsham on the edge of the Cotswolds. It was the home of Brigadier Andrew Parker Bowles and his wife Camilla. Andrew was a career soldier from a well-connected family. His father had been a close friend of the Queen Mother. Andrew himself had once dated Princess Anne. The Parker Bowleses were, in every sense, insiders. Their home was a frequent stop on the Gloucestershire social circuit. Camilla and Charles had first met in 1971, introduced at a polo match. The story, repeated so often it has acquired the status of legend, is that Camilla told Charles her great-grandmother had been the mistress of his great-great-grandfather, King Edward VII, and suggested they had history to live up to. Whether the line was delivered exactly that way matters less than what it reveals. From the beginning, their relationship carried an undertone of inevitability, of something that could be delayed but not prevented. They dated before Charles went to sea with the Royal Navy. When he returned, Camilla had married Andrew, but the friendship continued, the closeness continued, and when Charles bought Highgrove, the closeness had a postcode, 11 miles. That was the gap, not a metaphorical distance, not an emotional measure. 11 miles of Cotswold lanes, past fields of sheep and stone barns and villages with names like Shurston and Luckington. Charles could leave Highgrove after dinner and be at Middlewick before the plates were cleared. He could visit for an afternoon and return before anyone thought to wonder where he had been. Diana learned the geography quickly. She would later tell friends that she understood the significance of Highgrove's location before she fully understood the significance of Camilla. The house was not chosen for its architecture, or its farmland, or its proximity to good schools. It was chosen because it placed Charles within easy reach of the woman he had never stopped caring about. Whether this was a conscious decision or simply a convenient coincidence depends on whom you ask. Charles's defenders point to the many practical reasons for choosing Gloucestershire. The Duchy of Cornwall had extensive interest in the region. The Beaufort Hunt, which Charles rode with regularly, was based nearby. The county suited his tastes and his social world. The proximity to Camilla, they argue, was incidental. Diana did not believe this. She believed the proximity was the point. The social dynamics of Gloucestershire amplified the problem. In London, Charles and Camilla could be discreet. In the country, discretion was nearly impossible because it was unnecessary. Everyone in their circle knew about the relationship, or suspected, or chose not to ask. Camilla was a regular guest at dinners where Diana was also present. They moved through the same rooms, knew the same people, attended the same events. For Diana, this created an atmosphere of suffocating intimacy. She was expected to socialize with the woman she believed was her husband's lover. She was expected to smile, to make conversation, to behave as though the arrangement was perfectly normal. And in the world of Gloucestershire county life, it was normal. Affairs were understood. Discretion was valued. Scenes were not made. The rules were clear, even if they were never spoken aloud. But Diana was not from that world. She was the daughter of an earl, yes, and she had grown up on a royal estate. But her emotional vocabulary was different. She felt things openly. She expressed them directly. She did not understand why everyone around her seemed to accept something she found devastating, and she could not comprehend why the house her husband had bought for their family had been placed with such precision within easy driving distance of the woman who threatened to destroy it. The dinner parties continued. The weekends continued. Charles would disappear for hours, sometimes for an afternoon, sometimes for an evening. Staff at Highgrove were careful not to notice. Protection officers were careful not to comment. The machinery of royal life ensured that routines were maintained and questions were not asked. But Diana asked. She asked Charles directly, and the answers she received were evasive. She asked friends, and the answers she received were sympathetic but unhelpful. She asked herself, alone in the first-floor sitting room, why she had agreed to live in a house that was, by design or by accident, positioned at the center of her own humiliation. Highgrove was £865,000 worth of Georgian stone and English tradition. It had 9 bedrooms, 4 reception rooms, staff quarters, stables, and 347 acres of Gloucestershire farmland. But the number that mattered, the only number Diana could think about, was 11. 11 miles, 14 minutes. Close enough to be casual, close enough to be constant, close enough to ensure that the marriage Diana was trying to save was never beyond the reach of the woman who made saving it impossible. Chapter 5. The Garden That Replaced a Wife. Charles spent more hours consulting with Miriam Rothschild about wildflower seeds than he ever spent consulting Diana about their marriage. This is not speculation. The schedules, the meetings, the weekends devoted to planting and planning, all of it is documented. Charles kept notebooks about his garden. He wrote extensively about his plans for the landscape, about the philosophy behind his choices, about the spiritual connection he felt to the land. In 1993, he published a book about Highgrove's gardens. He wrote about earth and growth and patience. He wrote about the joy of nurturing something and watching it flourish. He did not write about Diana. The garden at Highgrove by the mid-1980s had become something extraordinary. It was not merely a rich man's hobby, it was a statement of identity. Every planting decision reflected Charles's deepest beliefs about the relationship between humanity and nature. The wildflower meadows were an argument against industrial agriculture. The organic kitchen garden was a rebuke to chemical farming. The hedgerows were a defense of biodiversity. The entire estate was becoming a manifesto, written not in words but in root systems and pollinator corridors and ancient species of apple tree. Miriam Rothschild's influence was profound. She was a scientist, an entomologist, a fellow of the Royal Society, and a woman of fierce eccentricity who wore Wellington boots to formal dinners. She and Charles shared a language that Diana could not access. They discussed the decline of native wildflower species with genuine anguish. They planned restoration projects with the urgency of people trying to save something precious. Their correspondence was voluminous. Their collaboration lasted years. Rosemary Varet brought a different kind of expertise. She was the grande dame of English garden design, famous for her own garden at Barnsley House, just 15 miles from Highgrove. Varet worked with Charles on the formal areas around the house. The Thyme Walk was her masterpiece at Highgrove, a long path flanked by mounds of creeping thyme in dozens of varieties, their colors shifting from deep purple to pale silver green across the seasons. Visitors walked it slowly, surrounded by fragrance, and felt that they had entered a world where time moved differently. The stumpery came later, in the late 1990s, but its origins were in conversations that began years earlier. It was built from approximately 300 root stumps of ancient oak trees, salvaged from estates and woodlands across England. The stumps were arranged in patterns that suggested both decay and growth, an art installation disguised as a garden feature. Ferns and hostas and shade-loving plants were woven between the roots. The effect was eerie and beautiful. It looked like a forest floor preserved by some act of gentle magic. Each of these projects consumed Charles's attention for months, sometimes years. He visited nurseries. He walked the grounds with designers. He stood in the rain examining soil drainage. He debated the placement of individual trees with the seriousness of a general deploying troops. The garden was not a retreat from responsibility. It was, for Charles, the highest form of responsibility. He believed that caring for land was a moral duty, and he discharged that duty with total commitment. Diana saw all of this, and what she saw was a man who could love something deeply, passionately, with his whole self, as long as that something was not her. The cruel irony of the garden was that it was, by every external measure, virtuous. No one could criticize a prince for planting wildflowers. No one could fault a future king for championing organic farming. The garden was good, it was important, it was pioneering. And precisely because it was all of those things, Diana could not compete with it without looking petty. She could not say, "My husband cares more about his time walk than our marriage," without seeming shallow. She could not describe the loneliness of watching a man pour his entire emotional life into 9 acres of soil without people thinking she was jealous of plants. But she was not jealous of plants. She was devastated by what the plants represented. They represented Charles's capacity for deep, sustained emotional investment, his ability to commit, his willingness to be patient, to show up every day, to do the difficult work of nurturing something over time. All the qualities Diana desperately needed from him as a husband, he was giving freely to his garden. The skills he could not or would not bring to their marriage, he brought to his meadows. By the late 1980s, the gardens at Highgrove covered 9 acres of intensively designed landscape, with 347 acres of wider parkland and farmland beyond. The estate employed a team of full-time gardeners. The annual maintenance budget was substantial. Rare specimens were sourced from botanical collections across Europe. The kitchen garden alone produced enough organic vegetables to supply the house and contribute to what would eventually become the Duchy Originals brand, a commercial enterprise that would generate millions in revenue. This was not a man pottering about with a trowel on Sunday afternoons. This was a man building a legacy, and the legacy was rooted, quite literally, in the ground of an estate where his wife felt like a stranger. Charles's relationship with Highgrove's gardens has often been framed as enlightened, and in many ways, it was. He was decades ahead of the mainstream in his commitment to organic farming, biodiversity, and sustainable land management. His ideas, mocked in the 1980s, are now environmental orthodoxy. The garden at Highgrove is, by any reasonable assessment, a significant achievement. But achievement and intimacy are not the same thing. And for Diana, watching her husband achieve something beautiful in the garden while failing to achieve anything meaningful in their marriage was a particular kind of torture. The garden bloomed, the marriage withered, and the two processes were connected because the energy and love that flowed into one was energy, and love diverted from the other. When Charles walked the thyme walk on a summer evening, surrounded by fragrance and color and the hum of bees in the lavender, he was at peace. When Diana sat in the first-floor sitting room watching him walk away, she was alone. Same house, same evening, two completely different realities. Chapter 6. The phone calls Diana could hear. The worst part was not the betrayal itself, but the way it happened under the same roof where her children slept. In 1989, a conversation between Charles and Camilla was recorded. The details of how the recording was made remain disputed. Some accounts attribute it to an amateur radio enthusiast who stumbled upon the frequency. Others suggest more deliberate surveillance. What is not disputed is the content. The conversation was intimate, affectionate, and unmistakably that of two people deeply involved with each other. It was made while Charles was at Highgrove. The recording was not published until January 1993, when transcripts appeared in the press. The public reaction was a mixture of fascination and embarrassment. The conversation included details so personal, so nakedly vulnerable, that even the tabloids seemed uncertain whether to mock or to look away. The Camillagate tapes, as they became known, confirmed what many had suspected and what Diana had known for years. Charles and Camilla's relationship was not a rumor. It was not gossip. It was real, ongoing, and conducted from inside the house where Diana lived with her children. For Diana, the publication of the tapes was both vindication and devastation. She had told people about the calls. She had described the experience of being in the house, hearing the phone ring in Charles's study, knowing who was calling, knowing what was being said, and being powerless to stop it. Few had fully believed her. The tapes made them believe. The physical reality of those phone calls is worth pausing over. Highgrove is not a vast palace. It is a 9-bedroom country house. The rooms are not separated by corridors hundreds of feet long. The study where Charles made his calls was close enough to the rest of the house that his voice, if raised, could carry. Diana did not need to eavesdrop. She simply needed to be present. Imagine it. A weekday evening at Highgrove. The boys are in bed. The staff have retreated to their quarters. Diana is in the sitting room or the drawing room or walking the upstairs corridor, and she hears Charles on the phone. Not the words, necessarily, but the tone, the warmth, the laughter, the softness in his voice that she recognized because she had once heard it directed at her, briefly, years ago, before the warmth found a different target. She described this experience to Andrew Morton, whose biography, Diana, Her True Story, was published in 1992. Morton's book, based on tape-recorded interviews with Diana herself, was an earthquake. It revealed the depth of Diana's unhappiness, her struggles with bulimia, her feelings of isolation, and her knowledge of Charles's relationship with Camilla. The book did not name Camilla directly in its first edition, but the implication was unmistakable. The combination of Morton's book in 1992 and the Camillagate tapes in 1993 created a public crisis that the royal family could not contain. But inside Highgrove, the crisis had been ongoing for years. The phone calls were not a revelation, they were a routine. Charles called Camilla. Diana knew. The household knew. The protection officers knew. Everyone knew, and knowing changed nothing. What the tapes destroyed was not the marriage. The marriage was already hollow. What the tapes destroyed was the pretense. They made it impossible for anyone, inside the palace or outside it, to maintain the fiction that Charles and Diana's relationship was merely going through a difficult patch, The tapes were evidence. They were proof. And they were recorded from inside a house that was supposed to be a family home. Highgrove, by the early 1990s, had become something no one had intended. It was not a sanctuary. It was not a family retreat. It was not the quiet country home where a prince and princess raised their children away from the pressures of public life. It was a crime scene of sorts, not a legal crime, but an emotional one. Every room in that house held a different kind of evidence. The nursery held the evidence of what Diana had tried to build. The garden held the evidence of where Charles had placed his heart. The study held the evidence of the calls, and the space between these rooms, the hallways and staircases and landings of a perfectly ordinary Georgian house, held the silence of two people who had run out of things to say to each other. Diana would later describe Highgrove as a prison, not because she was locked in, but because she was locked out of her husband's affections, locked out of the social world that had closed ranks around him and Camilla, locked out of the narrative of her own marriage. She was the Princess of Wales, living in a house that her husband had turned into a monument to everything she was not. The boys, William and Harry, were still young enough to be shielded from the worst of it. They were at boarding school for much of the year. Their weekends at Highgrove were managed carefully, full of outdoor activities and the distractions that wealth and status could provide. But children sense more than adults credit them for. They knew that their mother was unhappy. They knew that something was wrong with the house, with the weekends, with the way their parents occupied different rooms and different moods. By the end of 1993, Highgrove had been exposed. The phone calls, the tapes, the Morton book, the formal separation announced in December 1992. Everything was in the open. The house that Charles had bought to build a family had become the most documented site of a royal marriage's collapse. And Diana, the woman who had tried hardest to make it a home, was already beginning to leave. Outside, the garden continued to grow. The wildflowers bloomed on schedule. The thyme released its fragrance into the summer air. The kitchen garden produced its harvest. The ancient trees that Charles had planted as saplings were taking hold, putting down roots that would outlast the crisis, outlast the marriage, outlast the century itself. Nature does not read newspapers. It does not listen to tape recordings. It simply grows, indifferent to the suffering of the people who tend it. And at Highgrove, the growing had never been more vigorous than during the years when everything else was dying. Chapter 7. A Princess Refuses to Come Home. At some point in the late 1980s, Diana simply stopped going to Highgrove, and nobody in the household was surprised. The withdrawal was gradual. It did not happen in a single dramatic gesture, no slammed door, no tearful departure, no final argument that ended with a car pulling down the drive for the last time. Diana simply went to Highgrove less, and then hardly at all. She found reasons to stay in London. She had engagements. She had meetings with charity directors. She had dinners with friends. She needed to be near the boys' schools. Every excuse was reasonable. Every excuse was also a lie, or at least a partial truth covering a deeper one. Diana did not want to be at Highgrove because Highgrove had become the place where her unhappiness was most concentrated. Kensington Palace became her real home. Apartments 8 and 9 on the western side of the palace were Diana's territory. She decorated them to her taste without compromise. She filled them with photographs of William and Harry. She installed a modern kitchen where she could eat standing at the counter, something unthinkable at Highgrove, where meals were served formally. At Kensington, Diana could be herself. She could invite friends without worrying about the Gloucestershire social calendar. She could walk in Kensington Gardens without passing the Thyme walk. The weekends told the story. Charles stayed at Highgrove. Diana stayed in London. When the boys were home from school, arrangements were made. Sometimes they went to Gloucestershire. Sometimes they stayed with Diana. The logistics of a fractured family were managed by staff who had been trained to anticipate needs and avoid awkwardness. Highgrove staff noticed the change long before the public did. Housekeepers adjusted their routines. Rooms that had been kept ready for Diana were no longer prepared with the same urgency. The menus changed. The flowers changed. The entire domestic rhythm of the house shifted to accommodate a single occupant rather than a couple. And Charles, for his part, did not seem to mind. This is the uncomfortable truth that sits at the center of the Highgrove story. Charles's life at the estate improved when Diana stopped coming. The tension left the house. The arguments stopped. The weekends became peaceful. He could walk his gardens, tend his farm, have friends for dinner, and live the life of a country gentleman without the presence of a wife who was visibly suffering and unable to hide it. He filled the space Diana left, not immediately, and not always with Camilla, though her presence at Highgrove became less concealed over time. He filled it with routine, with gardening, with correspondence, with the kind of solitary, purposeful activity that suited his temperament. Charles was, by nature, a man who preferred his own company, or the company of people who shared his interests. Diana's energy, her emotional intensity, her need for connection and reassurance, these things exhausted him. Without her, Highgrove became the haven he had always wanted it to be. For Diana, the decision to stop visiting Highgrove was both a surrender and an act of defiance. She was surrendering the idea that the marriage could be saved. She was acknowledging that the house would never be hers, could never be hers, because it had been built around a set of values and relationships that excluded her. But she was also refusing to continue performing, refusing to sit in that first-floor room while the phone rang, refusing to smile at dinner parties where everyone knew her humiliation, refusing to pretend. The physical distance between Kensington Palace and Highgrove is approximately 100 miles. By car, it takes roughly 90 minutes, longer in traffic, shorter late at night when the motorway is empty. Diana knew that distance intimately. She had driven it or been driven dozens of times, watching the landscape shift from urban sprawl to open country, from the grey of London to the green of Gloucestershire. At some point, that journey stopped being a homecoming and started being a sentence. The moment she passed the junction for Swindon, she felt the weight of what was waiting. Her absence from Highgrove was the loudest thing she ever said about her marriage. Louder than the Morton book. Louder than the Panorama interview. The Princess of Wales, the woman the world adored, simply stopped going to the house her husband had bought for their family. And in that silence, that refusal, that empty chair at the dining table, the truth was more visible than any confession could have made it. Staff at Highgrove adapted with the quiet efficiency that defines royal household management. Menus were adjusted for one rather than two. The flowers in Diana's preferred sitting room were no longer refreshed on Fridays in anticipation of her weekend arrival. Laundry schedules changed. Security rotations changed. The entire domestic machinery of a country house recalibrated around the absence of its mistress, and the recalibration was so smooth that it seemed almost rehearsed. The boys navigated between two worlds, Weekends at Highgrove were outdoors, physical, structured around the estate. Charles taught them about farming. He showed them the gardens. He took them riding. There were go-kart tracks and adventure playgrounds built on the grounds, the kind of elaborate amusements that only wealth and acreage could provide. Weekends with Diana were London weekends, cinema trips and hamburger restaurants, and the kind of casual normalcy that Diana fought hard to give them. She took them to theme parks. She let them eat junk food. She dressed them in baseball caps and tried to make them feel, for a few hours, like ordinary boys with an ordinary mother. Neither world was complete. Neither world was what either parent had imagined when they married. But both parents loved their children, and the children, in their different ways, adapted. Highgrove, emptied of Diana, became more completely Charles's. He continued his work on the gardens. He expanded the organic farm. He hosted friends and fellow enthusiasts. He wrote about his vision for the estate. The house itself remained largely as Poplack had decorated it, Diana's one physical legacy still embedded in the fabrics and furnishings, growing slowly outdated, but never quite replaced. It was as if the house could not decide whether she had left or was simply away for the weekend. The irony was visible to anyone who cared to look. The house was more beautiful than ever. The gardens were entering their mature phase, the wildflower meadows thick with color, the hedgerows full of nesting birds, the kitchen garden producing abundantly. Highgrove had never looked better, and it had never been emptier of the thing that was supposed to give it meaning: a family, a marriage, a shared life. The beauty of the grounds and the hollowness of the house existed side by side, and the contrast was the truest thing about the place. Chapter 8. The Separation, written in stone. In December 1992, the Prime Minister stood before Parliament and announced what Highgrove had known for years. John Major's statement was measured, careful, and utterly inadequate to the scale of what it described. The Prince and Princess of Wales, he told the House of Commons, had decided to separate. There were no plans to divorce. Their constitutional positions were unaffected. The decision had been reached amicably. Every word was technically accurate and emotionally meaningless. The separation formalized what had been obvious for years. Charles would remain at Highgrove. Diana would remain at Kensington Palace. The geography of the split was clean, almost surgical. Gloucestershire and London, country and city, his world and hers. The legal and practical details were handled by teams of lawyers and palace officials. Finances were divided. Schedules for the children were negotiated. Public engagements were coordinated to avoid overlap. The machinery of the monarchy adapted, as it always does, to the realities of the people inside it. The crown had survived far worse than an unhappy marriage. It would survive this. But for Highgrove, the separation carried a specific weight. The house had been bought in 1980 as a family home. That was the stated purpose. A place for the Prince of Wales and his future wife and their future children to live a life that combined royal duty with personal warmth. That purpose was now void. Highgrove was no longer a family home. It was a bachelor residence occupied by a man in his mid-40s whose marriage had publicly collapsed. The house that had cost £865,000 had seen investments of several million more in gardens, farmland, and renovations. It employed a staff of groundskeepers, housekeepers, cooks, and security personnel. The gardens alone represented one of the most significant private horticultural projects in England, covering 9 acres of designed landscape and 347 acres of organic farmland. All of this infrastructure, All of this investment now served a single occupant and his weekend guests. William and Harry continued to visit. Their weekends at Highgrove were carefully managed. Charles was attentive, playful, engaged. He built a treehouse for them. He let them ride the farm vehicles. He involved them in estate life. Whatever had gone wrong between their parents, Charles's love for his sons was genuine and visible. Highgrove may have failed as a marital home, but as a father's weekend retreat, it functioned. The years between the separation in 1992 and the divorce in August 1996 were a long public unwinding. Diana gave her Panorama interview in November 1995, in which she spoke about Charles's relationship with Camilla and said, with devastating precision, that there were 3 of them in the marriage. The interview was watched by nearly 23 million viewers. It sealed the end of the marriage and, arguably, Diana's position within the royal family. The Panorama interview was filmed at Kensington Palace, not at Highgrove. That detail matters. Diana chose to make her most devastating public statement from the place that had become her refuge, not from the place that had been her prison. She wore minimal makeup. She looked directly into the camera. She spoke with a calm that was more devastating than any outburst could have been. And when she described her marriage, she described a triangle, and every viewer in the country knew that the third corner of that triangle was anchored 11 miles from a Georgian house in Gloucestershire. The divorce was finalized in August 1996. Diana received a settlement reported to be around £17 million, plus an annual allowance of £400,000. She lost the title Her Royal Highness, but retained the title Diana, Princess of Wales. She kept her apartments at Kensington Palace. The terms were negotiated by lawyers over months. The emotional cost, of course, was beyond any lawyer's capacity to calculate. Highgrove was not part of the settlement. It had never been hers to claim. It was Duchy of Cornwall property, and it remained with Charles. But the removal of Diana's name from any formal association with the house was the final act in a process that had begun years earlier. Highgrove was Charles's, entirely, completely, without qualification or contest. The house adjusted. Staff who had served both the prince and princess now served only the prince. Routines simplified. The house became quieter, more orderly, more reflective of a single person's rhythms. Charles continued his work in the gardens. He expanded his organic enterprise. He hosted small gatherings of like-minded thinkers. The kitchen garden produced more abundantly than ever. New projects were conceived and executed. The farm shop concept took shape. Highgrove settled into a new identity, not a family home, not a place of conflict, but a private estate with a public mission. Diana, in London, built a new life. She threw herself into charity work, particularly her campaign against landmines, which would take her to Angola and Bosnia. She visited hospitals and sat at bedsides. She held the hands of people the rest of the world preferred not to touch. She dated. She socialized. She was, by many accounts, finding a version of happiness that had eluded her during the marriage. Kensington Palace was hers in a way Highgrove had never been. She filled it with her own energy, her own friends, her own rules. She played her music as loud as she wanted. She ate what she wanted. She answered to nobody. But the shadow of Highgrove never entirely lifted. The house remained, in Diana's mind and in the public imagination, the place where her marriage had been most visibly broken. It was the backdrop to her loneliest years, and as long as it stood, as long as the gardens bloomed and the visitors came, and Charles walked the thyme walk at sunset, it was a reminder of everything she had lost and everything she had never truly been given. Chapter 9, August 1997. When the news came from Paris, Charles was at Balmoral, but it was Highgrove that held the evidence of everything he had failed to protect. The early hours of the 31st of August, 1997. A Mercedes S280 in a tunnel beneath the Pont de l'Alma in Paris. Speeds later estimated at over 60 miles per hour. Henri Paul at the wheel, Dodi Fayed in the back seat, Diana beside him. The call came to Balmoral, where Charles was staying with William and Harry. The Queen was there, Prince Philip was there. The family was gathered for the annual summer holiday. It was Charles who told his sons that their mother was dead. The details of that conversation are, rightly, private. But the weight of it is unimaginable. Diana was 36 years old. She had been divorced for just over a year. She had been separated for nearly 5. She had spent the last decade of her life becoming the most photographed, most discussed, most loved, and most scrutinized woman on the planet. And now she was gone, in a tunnel, in the middle of the night, in a city that was not her home. The days that followed were unlike anything the modern monarchy had experienced. The public grief was oceanic. Flowers piled outside Kensington Palace in drifts that reached waist height. The mall was carpeted with bouquets. Mourners queued for hours to sign books of condolence. The world stopped, briefly, and wept for a woman most people had never met but felt they knew. Charles brought his sons back to London. The funeral was held on the 6th of September at Westminster Abbey. Earl Spencer's eulogy was fierce and pointed. Elton John played a revised version of his song for Marilyn Monroe. The cortege passed through streets lined with millions. It was, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary public events in British history. And then it was over. The flowers wilted. The cameras moved on. The world resumed its routines. And Highgrove stood where it had always stood, in its 347 acres of Gloucestershire countryside, surrounded by the gardens Charles had built during the years when his marriage was falling apart. In the weeks and months after the funeral, Charles returned to Highgrove. He had no choice. It was his home. The boys went back to school. The staff resumed their duties. The gardens needed tending because gardens do not pause for grief. The autumn plantings had to go in. The meadows had to be cut. The hedgerows had to be maintained. There is something both brutal and merciful about the calendar of a working estate. It forces you to keep moving. It insists that the cycle of growth and decay continues regardless of what has happened to the people who own the land. Charles walked the grounds that autumn, and what he walked through was a landscape he had built during the very years when his marriage was collapsing. Every planting corresponded to a year. The wildflower meadow, seeded in the mid-1980s, corresponded to the years of deepening estrangement. The thyme walk, established in the late 80s, corresponded to the years when Diana stopped coming to Highgrove. The stumpery, begun in the 90s, corresponded to the years of public exposure and divorce. The garden was a timeline of personal failure expressed in botanical beauty. What Highgrove held after Diana's death was not a memorial, it was an absence. Walk through the house today, and you will find no portrait of Diana on the walls, no room preserved as she left it, no plaque, no dedication, no trace. The woman who was the most famous inhabitant of Highgrove, the woman whose suffering within those walls generated millions of newspaper columns and dozens of books and a grief that engulfed an entire nation, has been edited out of the story the house tells about itself. This is not cruelty, exactly, or if it is the passive cruelty of moving on. Charles continued to live at Highgrove. He continued to develop the gardens. He continued his life. And continuing meant not freezing the house in a moment of tragedy. It meant allowing the rooms to change, the furnishings to evolve, the house to grow into its next chapter. Other royal residences have preserved rooms as time capsules. Queen Victoria kept Prince Albert's rooms at Windsor essentially untouched for decades after his death. But Highgrove was not given that treatment. Diana's rooms were redecorated. Her choices were replaced. The house moved forward. But the completeness of Diana's erasure from Highgrove is striking. At Kensington Palace, the sunken garden was redesigned in her memory. A statue was unveiled in 2021, commissioned by William and Harry. She is remembered in London. She is not remembered in Gloucestershire. The house that witnessed her greatest unhappiness preserves no evidence of her presence. The garden that replaced her as the object of her husband's devotion blooms more beautifully each year. The staff have changed. The furnishings have changed. The world has moved on. And Diana, who once sat alone in a first-floor room listening to a telephone ring in the next room, exists at Highgrove only as a ghost that no one acknowledges. Chapter 10. The King's Garden opens its gates. Today you can buy a jar of Highgrove honey for £12 and walk the same paths where a princess once cried. The transformation of Highgrove from a private estate to a public brand happened gradually, but its commercial dimensions are now substantial. The gardens open to visitors each spring and summer. Tickets cost £30 per person. 15,000 visitors walk the grounds each year. They follow guided routes through the wildflower meadows, the sundial garden, the stumpery, the thyme walk. They admire the organic kitchen garden. They photograph the ancient oaks. They buy souvenirs from the Highgrove shop. The shop is its own phenomenon. Located on the estate grounds, it sells a carefully curated range of products bearing the Highgrove name. Organic jams, biscuits, honey from the estate's own hives, scented candles, garden tools, cushions embroidered with botanical designs, books about the gardens, some written or co-authored by Charles himself. Prices range from a few pounds for a bar of soap to several hundred for larger items. The shop generates significant revenue, much of which is directed to the Prince's Foundation and its associated charities. The Duchy Originals brand, now known as Waitrose Duchy Organic, grew directly from Highgrove's kitchen garden. Launched in 1992, it began with a single product, an oaten biscuit made from organic oats grown on the home farm at Highgrove. The brand expanded over the following decades into hundreds of products, from sausages to chocolate to ale. Annual revenues reached tens of millions of pounds. The entire enterprise was rooted in the soil of Highgrove, in Charles's conviction that organic farming was not just environmentally responsible, but commercially viable. The garden tours are meticulously managed. Visitors are guided along prescribed paths. They see what the estate wants them to see: the wildflower meadows in full bloom, the walled garden with its espaliered fruit trees, the stumpery with its 300 ancient oak root stumps arranged like the bones of a prehistoric forest. Every sightline is considered. Every planting is intentional. The experience is beautiful, carefully controlled, and completely silent about the human drama that unfolded inside the house. The guided commentaries focus on horticulture, ecology, and Charles's environmental vision. They discuss soil health and companion planting and the importance of pollinators. They mention Miriam Rothschild and Rosemary Verrey. They do not mention Diana. They do not discuss phone calls or separations or the meaning of 11 miles. The story Highgrove tells about itself is a story of gardens and stewardship, and one man's dedication to the land. It is a true story, but it is not the complete story. Visitors leave Highgrove with a sense of admiration. The gardens are genuinely remarkable. The commitment to organic principles is real and long-standing. The beauty is undeniable. But some visitors, the ones who remember the 1980s and 1990s, the ones who watch the fairy tale collapse in real time, walk those paths with an awareness that the official narrative omits. They know that the meadow where they stand was planted during the same years when a marriage was dying. They know that the thyme walk was designed while a princess sat alone upstairs. They know, and they walk quietly, and they do not ask the guides. The house itself is not part of the tour. Visitors see only the gardens, the rooms where Diana ate breakfast, where she argued with Charles, where she sat listening to phone calls she could not unhear, are closed to the public. The exterior of the house is visible from the gardens, its pale Georgian stone looking exactly as it has looked for more than 2 centuries. Visitors photograph it from a distance. They do not enter. Whatever the house contains, whatever traces of its history remain inside those walls, they are not for public consumption. The story of Highgrove, as told to its 15,000 annual visitors, is a story that begins and ends in the garden. The house is merely the backdrop, and what happened inside it is nobody's business. Chapter 11. Camilla's name on the door. The woman who was once the reason Diana fled Highgrove now sleeps in its master bedroom as queen. On the 9th of April, 2005, Charles married Camilla Parker Bowles at Windsor Guildhall. The ceremony was civil, not religious, a concession to the complexity of their circumstances. The Queen did not attend the civil ceremony, but hosted the blessing at Windsor Castle afterwards. Camilla took the title Duchess of Cornwall, choosing not to use the title Princess of Wales out of respect for Diana's memory. After the wedding, Camilla moved into Highgrove. Consider what this means. The house that Charles bought in 1980. The house where Diana tried to build a family. The house she fled because of Camilla's presence in her marriage, became Camilla's home. The bedroom where Diana slept became Camilla's bedroom. The drawing room where Diana sat alone became Camilla's drawing room. The garden paths where Diana walked while trying to understand her husband's absences became the paths Camilla walked as his wife. The redecoration was inevitable. Camilla brought her own taste, her own furniture, her own sense of what a home should feel like. She is, by all accounts, a woman of warm, unfussy style. She likes comfort, she likes dogs and horses and country life. She likes the kind of relaxed, convivial hospitality that Gloucestershire specializes in. In many ways, she is a better match for Highgrove than Diana ever was, not because she is a better person, but because her temperament aligns with the house and the life it represents. The public reaction to Camilla's residence at Highgrove evolved over time. Initially, many people found it uncomfortable. The association with Diana's suffering was too strong, too recent. The idea that Camilla could simply move into the house where Diana had been so unhappy felt wrong to many who still mourned the princess. But public sentiment, like everything else, is subject to erosion and revision. Over the years, Camilla has built her own relationship with Highgrove. She has contributed to the gardens. She has hosted events. She has been photographed there, looking relaxed and happy, which she appears to genuinely be. The house has absorbed her presence the way it absorbs everything, quietly, completely, without visible seams. there is a particular image that captures this absorption. Camilla walking the gardens with a terrier at her heels, wearing a waxed jacket and wellies, pointing at something in a flower bed with the casual authority of someone who belongs. It is the image Diana could never produce because Diana never felt she belonged. Camilla belongs at Highgrove because Highgrove was always, in some fundamental sense, waiting for her, not consciously. Houses do not wait, but the life the house represents, the country life, the garden life, the dinner party life, the Gloucestershire life, that was always Camilla's world more than it was Diana's. The house and the woman finally match. When Charles became king on the 8th of September, 2022, following the death of Queen Elizabeth II, the question of Highgrove's future took on new significance. Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle became the primary royal residences. But Highgrove remained, as it had always been, Charles's personal retreat, the place where he felt most himself, the garden he had spent more than 4 decades building. The property now sits within a portfolio of royal residences, but it holds a place in Charles's life that no palace can replicate. It is the only home he chose for himself, the only landscape he shaped with his own hands and vision. Camilla, now Queen Consort, and from February 2024, simply Queen Camilla, continues to use Highgrove as a country home. The gardens continue to grow. The shop continues to sell organic honey. The visitors continue to walk the paths. The house has delivered, at last, the life Charles always wanted. A country estate managed according to his principles. A partner who shares his interests and his world. Dogs on sofas, friends for dinner. Long walks through the garden at dusk. Evenings spent reading by the fire in a room that smells of wood smoke and lavender. It is the life Diana was supposed to have shared. It is the life that was always going to be Camilla's. And the completeness of that fulfillment, the neatness with which everything eventually fell into place, is either a love story that triumphed over adversity or a betrayal that outlasted its victim. The answer depends on who you were when you started watching. Chapter 12. The House That Remembers Nothing. Highgrove will never tell you what happened inside it, but the silence itself is a kind of confession. Houses do not have memories. This is the obvious truth. Stone and plaster and timber do not absorb the emotions of the people who live within them. A wall does not know who cried against it. A floor does not remember who paced it at 3 in the morning. A garden does not care who planted it or why. These are objects, materials. They have no consciousness, no loyalty, no guilt, and yet we act as if they do. We visit the homes of the famous and the fallen and expect to feel something. We walk the corridors of stately houses and look for traces of the people who once lived there. We believe, against all reason, that houses hold something of the lives they have witnessed, that the air in an old room carries an echo, that the creak of a floorboard is a kind of speech. Highgrove resists this impulse. It has been carefully, thoroughly, relentlessly updated. The house Charles bought in 1980 is not the house that stands today. It has been renovated, redecorated, extended, and refined. Every surface has been touched. Every room has been reconsidered. The poplack interiors that Diana chose are gone, replaced by successive waves of redecoration that reflect the tastes of a man who has spent more than 40 years thinking about what a home should look like. Diana's fingerprints are nowhere. Not literally, of course. Those were cleaned away decades ago. But figuratively, symbolically, in every way that matters to the question of legacy. There is no room called Diana's room. There is no wing associated with her memory. There is no corner of the garden planted in her honor. The woman who lived in this house from 1981 to the late 1980s, the woman who gave birth to 2 future kings and endured a level of personal suffering that would have destroyed most people, has been completely absorbed by the house and completely erased from it. The gardens tell a different story. They tell Charles's story. Every planting is a chapter. The wildflower meadows speak of his early idealism. The stumpery speaks of his mature aesthetic. The kitchen garden speaks of his entrepreneurial instincts. The thyme walk speaks of his patience, his attention to detail, his belief that beautiful things require time and care. The gardens are an autobiography written in chlorophyll and root systems, and they are magnificent. 15,000 visitors a year walk through these gardens and feel the presence of the man who made them. They do not feel the presence of the woman who watched them being made from a window upstairs. They do not feel her loneliness, her frustration, her slow comprehension that the man she married was capable of great love, just not for her. They feel the beauty of the gardens, and the beauty is real. But it is also a kind of overwriting, a beautiful text laid down on top of a painful one, until the original is no longer legible. This is what Highgrove teaches us, if we are willing to learn it. Houses do not preserve the people who suffered in them. They preserve the people who stayed, the people who continued, the people who won. Charles won Highgrove. He won it not by conquest, but by persistence. He simply kept going. He kept planting. He kept building. He kept walking the paths and tending the soil and living the life he had always imagined, even when that life required the removal or the departure or the erasure of the woman who was supposed to share it. His vision for the estate was stronger than his marriage. His love for the land was deeper than his love for his wife. And the house, obedient as houses always are, shaped itself to its surviving owner. Diana exists at Highgrove only as an absence. A question visitors are too polite to ask, a gap in the guided tour, a silence where there should be a story. She is the most famous woman of her generation, and in the place where her unhappiness was most acute, she has vanished entirely. The gardens bloom more beautifully than ever. The wildflower meadows shimmer in the June sunlight. The thyme walk releases its fragrance under the feet of paying visitors. The stumpery, with its 300 ancient oak roots, stands like a monument to the patient accumulation of time. And somewhere, in a room on the first floor, there is nothing left to tell you that a woman once sat there, alone, listening to a phone ring in the next room, understanding at last that the house her husband built was never meant for her.